Disclosure: I was invited by the Militärhistorische Museum der Bundeswehr in Dresden. What was the German perspective on the heavy Is-2 tank? Note, this video is based mostly on Jens Wehner's research and what he found in the German military archives. Additionally, I added some of the stuff I found over the years as well. First off, some basics about the Is-2. The 122mm gun of the Is-2 was a devastating weapon, yet if one looks at just the armor penetration values, one might think otherwise. As so often, the devil lies in the details. Here you can see the approximate armor penetration values of the Is-2's gun versus the gun of the Königstiger at a 30-degree angle. Yet the projectile of the Is-2 was rather heavy and had quite an explosive filler. As such, the force of the impact and explosion was sometimes enough to blow off the turret of tanks or severely damage them. Its main drawback was a low amount of ammunition and a slow rate of fire. Its frontal upper hull armor was 120mm at 30 degree for the early model. The turret had a 100mm and was curved. Since the Is-2 used cast and not rolled steel, the armor strength was about 10 to 20% weaker. The Is-2 was very small and rather lightweight for its armor and firepower. As such, it had a power-to-weight ratio of 11.3 horsepower per metric ton. Note, this is just a glimpse. For more information, check out my video on the Is-2. Before the Germans encountered the Is-2 on the battlefield, the military intelligence organization for the Eastern Front, Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, had gathered from prisoners of war interrogations that a new heavy tank was likely being fielded soon. In January 1944, a report noted, a tank named Josef Stalin was mentioned several times in prisoner statements, mostly in connection with the reorganization of the KV-1 production to KV-85. Yet the following paragraph dismissed this information. It noted that the trials of the Soviets to produce a super heavy tank, Überschwerpanzer, but so far did not produce any results. As such, the possibility that they succeeded now is unlikely, and it is suggested that it might be a confusion with the KV-85. Nevertheless, it seems later on the Germans got convinced that indeed a new heavy Soviet tank was a threat, since according to Peter Samsonov, the first Is-2 saw action already in February 1944. More reports probably reached the Germans, although we did not find any of these reports so far. Yet we know that in March 1944 the Germans conducted calculations based on estimated available data on the penetration chances of different weapons versus the new Soviet tanks T-34-85 and Is-122, which was a name that both the Germans and Soviet used for the Is-2 as well. They used data from 4 German and 2 Soviet guns, namely the 75mm gun of the Panzer IV, the 75mm gun of the Panther, the 88mm gun of the Tiger I, and the 88mm from the King Tiger. Additionally, the Soviet 85mm gun from the T-34-85 and the 102mm gun from the Is-2. Based on the various values, they compared vehicles, including fictional ones, to the Soviet tanks. The results were as follows. The Panzer IV was seen as far inferior to the Is-2. The Panther was seen as superior to the Is-2 if engaged each other frontally, but inferior if they would engage each other's sides or rears. Tiger I was seen as inferior to the Is-2. The fictional Tiger I with the 88mm from the Königstiger was seen as superior compared to the Is-2, and the Königstiger was seen as far superior to the Is-2. In April 1944, another report showed up at Fremde Heere Ost, namely from the 1st Panzerarmee. One of its Panzer divisions had supposedly destroyed an Su-122 and an Su-152. Yet the retrieved documents suggested that the vehicles were indeed called JS-122 and JS-152. Note that in English this would be IS instead of JS. The report notes that the differences to the known Su were marginal, namely that only the engines were weaker and that the starter was more modern. This is quite interesting because while the Su-152 and Is-152 are similar, namely the same gun, almost same height, very similar shape, similar track wheels but different armor values, although those are hard to measure, this is absolutely not the case for the Su-122 and Isu-122. These were very different, namely the SU-122 had a shorter barrel, while the ISU-122 had a long barrel. The ISU-122 had small track wheels, while the SU-122 had large track wheels, since it was based on the T-34 chassis. As such, it is quite odd that they noted the difference in the engines and the startup, but did not notice a difference on the chassis and gun, as I'm not the only one that was a bit puzzled here. The report then notes that the abbreviation JS is confusing because it was assumed that the JS abbreviation would be used for the new heavy tank mentioned in the various prisoners of war reports, but that was a tank with a turret, not an assault gun. So something likely was mixed up here. Finally, in early May 1944, the first clear combats report showed up in the German archives that are based on the examination of destroyed Is-2s. On 3rd May 1944, the Panzer Regiment Großdeutschland fought near Tagul-Fromos. A particular threat was posed by a battalion of heavy Stalin tanks on which the projectiles of the Tiger tanks were visibly rebounding at a combat distance of over 2,000 meters. The armor of the new Soviet tanks, Joseph Stalin II, Is-2, was no longer so easy to penetrate by shells from the front. Hasso von Manteuffel, the commander of the Panzergrenadierdivision Großdeutschland, recalled that the first came to the attention of his own division when he was able to examine fragged vehicles that had been knocked out. Private Werner Wegner said that when the new Joseph Stalin breakthrough tanks opened fire on German Panthers from a distance of 2,000 to 3,000 meters, the Panthers had to retreat. The division reported the destruction of 4 Is-2s, particularly noting the 2 were destroyed by Panzer IVs at 500-meter range. According to the author Tewes, this was achieved by hits in the rear. German tank crews had the impression that the Soviet crews were insufficiently trained. Attached to the report by Großdeutschland about the engagement was an illustration of the Is-2 from the front, rear side and top, including measurements. It is dated 6th May 1944, so 3 days after the engagement. It also contains data on the armor thickness. That is in line with the data provided by Peter Samsonov in his book about the Is-2. Sadly, I don't know where the Germans got these values from that early on. On probably the 26th May 1944, a preliminary report was released. I'm not certain about the date since the day was written by hand. It is prefaced that the data is based on existing examinations, troop reports and captured documents. Additionally, that the Is-2 had reached the army testing facility at Kummersdorf and further trials would be conducted. The report notes that the muzzle brake is designed after German design. It is particularly noted that the turret is very low. One main difference between the previous designs is that the driver is seated at the center and not the side, and that the front is completely sloped and/or curved. The summary notes the small width of 3.12 meters in contrast to the KV-1 with 3.55 and the KV-85 with 3.25 shows that it is narrow enough to be used on the German railway lines, which indicates offensive intent against Europe. The firing height of just 2 meters is mentioned and that the turret houses a 120mm gun, although it has only a height of 87 cm, while it can be traversed to 360 degrees. There is also an error, namely it is noted that the turret armor is weaker compared to the KV-85, while the armor thickness was the same. Although considering that the data from May 1944 illustration is correct, the question arises if this error stems from incorrect KV-85 data. As a particular weakness, it is mentioned that the louvres at the rear for air cooling have no protection against infantry anti-tank weapons. It is concluded that the Is-2 is a very formidable enemy. In the 1944 issue of the Bulletin of the Panzerwaffe, the Is-2 was likely first reported to a wider audience. The headline was Neuer russischer Panzerkampfwagen, New Russian Tank IS-122, in parentheses Joseph Stalin with a question mark. Keep in mind that the Germans generally called nearly everything Soviet Russian. Additionally, here's an exception, since they used IS and only one period, whereas it usually was JS and 2 periods. It states that in the south of the Eastern Front a heavy tank was destroyed, and it is likely the Joseph Stalin tank that was announced in various messages. It is particularly noted that the previously announced armor thickness of 250mm is not correct. Then technical data is provided, namely a weight of 50 metric tons with the remark that it is an estimated value. The values are mostly similar and/or identical to the previous reports, same with the weapons. What is particularly interesting and different to previous reports is that the observation devices are listed, which in my opinion underlines that basically everyone, except tankers, seem to forget how limited visibility is in tanks. It is noted in parentheses that these are observation devices that could be determined from a burnt out tank. The list notes 3 periscopes for the driver, 1 in the turret right to the gun, 1 in the turret in the commander's cupola, 1 telescopic sight in the turret left of the gun, and 6 vision slits in the commander's cupola. There is also a section about engaging the Is-2. It is prefaced that it is similar to the KV-85, although with about 30mm more for the hull and superstructure. It is noted that the gun of the Panther, Tiger 1 and PAK-43 can penetrate the strongest part at 1000 meters, although noting that the frontal part where the driver is seated is particularly strong and the value should be halved, while weaker parts can be penetrated at up to 3000 meters. For heavy weapons like infantry support guns and artillery, it is noted that high explosive anti-tank rounds should be used, while high explosive rounds can be used against optics, vision slits, the suspension, and to jam the turret. Small arms can be used to obstruct vision slits and optical devices. For close combat anti-tank infantry, the turret machine gun in the rear of the turret is particularly mentioned as a threat, while hollow charges, satchel charges, Panzerfaust, Panzerschreck, and anti-tank mines can have a devastating effect. In another issue of the Bulletin from September 1944, there was a combat report of Tigers engaging Is-2s in extremely close combat within the woods, namely at ranges around 50 meters. I'm not sure how representative the report is. If it is correct, I would say that German troops were at least lucky. It is noted that due to the thick forest, tanks had to advance in single file and the visibility was down to 50 meters, and that the Tigers basically ran into the Is-2 that were in position, yet were able to get the first shot off. To quote, "In spite of the poor visibility, the platoon leader started the firefight at a range of 35 meters. In response, the Joseph Stalin tank pulled back behind a small hill. In the meantime, the second Tiger had taken the lead and fired 3 shots at the enemy tank. When the third round was fired, the Tiger itself was hit by a 12.2 centimeter shell on the front below the radio operator's position. Apparently, this armor-piercing shell didn't penetrate through because the Tiger was standing at an angle from the target. The enemy tank was knocked out of action by a shot which penetrated the gun. A second Joseph Stalin tank attempted to cover the first as it pulled back. During a short firefight, one of these 2 Tigers hit the second tank under the gun. This round penetrated immediately, setting the enemy tank on fire. The rate of fire of the Joseph Stalin tanks was comparatively low. The commander made several observations, namely that if the Tiger appears, most Stalin tanks turn away and try to avoid a firefight, adding that in most cases they only engage above ranges of 2000 meters, but also only if they are in a favorable position. Furthermore, that the enemy crews tend to leave the tanks immediately after first shots are fired at them. It is also noted that the enemy usually tries to prevent Stalin tanks to fall into German hands by blowing them up. This seems to be in line with several other German reports I know where they basically complain that the enemy is too timid. As usually it should be taken with a grain of salt, the following points seem to be more valuable. Sixth, an attempt should be made to gain the flank or the rear of the Joseph Stalin tank and destroy him with concentrated fire. 7. In addition, a firefight with Joseph Stalin tanks should not be undertaken in less than platoon strength, which is 4 Tigers. Employment of single Tigers means their loss. It has proven to be useful after the first hits are registered to blind the Joseph Stalin by firing Sprenggranaten, high explosive shells. In early 1945, the Germans expert did compare various German Allied tanks and created charts and infographics. These included the Is-2. The Germans were particularly fond of the Is-2's armor, but quite skeptical about the gun. This is understandable. The Is-2 could only carry around 28 rounds of ammo. In contrast, the Königstiger had around 84. The large size had additional drawbacks. The 122mm armor was 2-piece ammunition, so the shell with the propellant and the projectile were loaded separately. This reduced the rate of fire considerably. Let us look at the results of the German comparison. Note This is under the assumption that the tanks face off in a 1 versus 1 combat and that they are ranked them from -3 to +3. So the Is-2 was compared to the following German tanks in combat where they engage each other frontally with these results. The Panzer IV received a -3, the Tiger I received a -2, the Jagdpanzer IV with the long 75mm gun that was also used in the Panther received a +1, the Panther itself received a +2, and the Tiger II was at a +3. The results were quite different if the tanks faced each other sideways. Here the Panzer IV was at -3, all others except the King Tiger at -2, which was at +2. Jens Wehner notes that this assessment hardly differed from the first technical German assessments in spring 1944, so it was never the case that the Germans did not know how to evaluate this tank. To conclude, the Germans were aware that the Is-2 was coming, although a bit skeptical as well, since for quite some time a new heavy Soviet tank was reported by prisoners of war. It should also be noted that I have seen quite staggering and ridiculous prisoners of war statements as well. Although the Is-2 was already used in combat in February 1944, the first well-recorded engagement was reported by the Germans in early May 1944. Only a few days later they had data on the armor values that was correct. Similarly, most of their assessment in the early reports were correct as well. They clearly realized it was a formidable enemy, but did not seem to be overly concerned. In overall, it seems the Germans respected the Is-2, but it was not a real shock. Considering that the Germans for a long time fought against the T-34 and even KV tanks with various inferior weapons, including guns like the 37mm anti-tank gun and similar tank guns, this makes more sense. They were used to fighting heavy armored tanks and thus had proper tactics for quite some time as well. As Jens Wehner states, the Is-2 was not a game changer, just an additional nail in the coffin of the Wehrmacht. Big thank you to Jens Wehner for providing me with his script and sources. Thank you to the Militärhistorische Museum der Bundeswehr in Dresden for inviting me. Thank you for watching and see you next time.